Hello, and welcome to the Get Lit Festival. I'm Kate Peterson, Director of Get Lit Programs, a nonprofit housed within Eastern Washington University. Get Lit is a week-long celebration of literature traditionally held in Spokane, Washington. This year, all of our events are virtual, and virtually all of them are free. To learn more about Get Lit, to find this year's schedule of events, or to donate, please click on the link below to visit our website, getlitfestival.org. Now I'd like to introduce Claire Walla, Get Lit's Assistant Coordinator.
Thanks, Kate, and thank you all for joining us for Unmaking the Patriarchy of the Mind. This reading and discussion, which will delve into writing that subverts patriarchal expectations, stems directly from the literary work of our five authors, all of whom you can read about more on our website. Before we hand it off to Alexandra Teague, who will be moderating this event, I'd like to give her a quick introduction. Alexandra Teague's third book of poetry, or What We'll Call Desire, was published by Persia in August of 2019. Alexandra is a professor at the University of Idaho and has previously written three books: The Wise and Foolish Builders, Mortal Geography, which won the Lexi Rudnitsky Prize and the California Book Award Gold Medal in Poetry, as well as the novel The Principles Behind Flotation. She also co-edited the anthology Bullets into Bells, Poets and Citizens Respond to Gun Violence. Welcome, Alexandra.
Thank you, Claire and Kate, and for all your hard work putting this together. I'm so excited to be here with my fellow panelists, all of whom are writers who I greatly admire. So I'm going to quickly introduce all of the panelists, and then we're going to alternate readings and asking each other questions, which I'm also excited for. So my fellow panelists are Brooke Matson, whose second collection of poetry in accelerated silence was selected by Mark Doty as winner of the 2010 Jake Adam York Prize and released from Milkwood Editions in 2020. Matson's poems have appeared in journals such as Prairie Schooner, Willow Springs, and Copper Nickel. She is executive director of the creative nonprofit Spark Central in Spokane. Kristen Miyares-Young is the author of the novel Subduction, a Paris Review staff pick named a finalist for 2 International Latino Book Awards in 2020. A prize-winning journalist and essayist, Kristen served as 2018 to 20 prose writer in residence at Hugo House in Seattle. Her work appears recently in the Washington Post, Literary Hub, The Guardian, Pank, The Rumpus, and anthologies including Latina Outsiders, Pie and Whiskey, Alone Together, and Advanced Creative Nonfiction. Sonora Jha, PhD, is a novelist, essayist, researcher, and professor of journalism at Seattle University. She is the author of the novel Foreign, based on the true stories of farmers' suicides in India, where she was born. Her op-eds and essays have appeared in the New York Times, Seattle Times, and elsewhere. She teaches fiction and essay writing at places including Hugo House and Hedgebrook Writers Retreat. Her new book is How to Raise a Feminist Son, Motherhood, Masculinity, and the Making of My Family, coming out from Sasquatch Books and Penguin Random House India in April of this year. And finally, Laura Reed is the author of Dresses from the Old Country, BOA 2018, Instructions for My Mother's Funeral, University of Pittsburgh Press 2012, and The Chewbacca at Hollywood Boulevard Reminds Me of You, Floating Bridge Press 2011. She served as poet laureate for Spokane from 2015 to 17 and teaches at Spokane Falls Community College. And Laura will be our first reader.
Thank you, Alexandra. Okay, the first poem I'm going to read is called Phalangocentric, which is a word I didn't know until the incident that this poem describes. Phalangocentric. At the spring quarter composition meeting, my male colleague runs up to the board and writes the word phalangocentric, and then explains that the essay in the Western tradition is phallic. He says we should tell our students this so they know the tradition they're writing in. I raise my hand and wait for a long time to be called on, and when I am, the director of composition apologizes, and I say, it's no problem. I've just been waiting patiently like a woman, which I thought would draw a laugh, but apparently there are some things about which we should be honest and others we shouldn't. I say, I am not going to tell my students that, and then ask them to follow the rules we just questioned. Why not say the main idea can be arrived at? Or maybe there is no main idea. Maybe there are so many little ideas sticking out like curls that won't be brushed down. I know you can't brush curls. Doesn't everyone who has them? You have to use leave-in conditioner and product and scrunch them and then try not to touch them, or they will break and turn to frizz, and then where will you be? All week now, I've been thinking of this word, phalangocentric, which my friend said Derrida invented, and Wikipedia says is a portmanteau, which I guess is a blending of two words, but which I thought was a suitcase. I love suitcases. I love the satiny lining and the clasps and how they make me think of trains and steam and hoop skirts and top hats. How did I get here? Does it matter? Will I arrive? I don't know, but out the window, voila, the whole French countryside that Derrida once flew past while he thought about masculinity and language. Sometimes I think about dying, and what I see is the white sheet my boyfriend and I washed and draped over our balcony in Nice. We left it there to dry and walked through the city and ate chocolate and climbed up the hill and looked out over the Mediterranean, which is so many shades of blue and green you can't imagine. And he smoked a pipe, which I think made him feel more like a man, something I couldn't say then, but I could now if I could find him. Would he laugh? Would he remember how when we got back, the sheet was dry and perfectly white and looked like nothing had happened? Thanks. The next poem I'm going to read is also about an incident of sexism at my workplace, which is common. It's called Jane Doe 1 through 9, and it's a true story. Jane Doe 1 through 9. The president of my college has been accused by 9 Jane Does. Jane Doe is what we call an unidentified body. One Jane says he put his hand on her breast. One Jane says he showed her his penis. One Jane took notes of everything he said and did. Smart girl, he might have said. The road I drive to the college is lined with evergreens. It's not that evergreens don't lose their needles, but that they replace them quickly. My mother's name is Jane. She was an only child, lonely in the woods of childhood. I read mysteries inside that silence, stared at a shaft of light where you could see particles of dust. I couldn't believe I hadn't known they were there. One Jane says, of course she did not come forward. Would we have believed her? One Jane said, don't walk home in the darkness. One Jane said, yes, she had sex with him, but she was afraid for her job. One Jane said he texted her 559 times in one day. One Jane destroyed the records. One Jane taught me how to read, sketch of a girl on an empty page with her brother Dick and their dog Spot. I liked how only some of the page was picture. People can appear from out of nowhere. There's also a younger girl in a red wagon. Jane is pulling her, but she is also Jane. And then this last one, I think it's a funny story, but also outrageous. And it's called R.I.P. Laura's Vagina. Your vagina is beginning to devitalize, the doctor explained when I asked him why I had had so many urinary tract infections lately. The first thing I thought was that I should say, no, your vagina is devitalizing because I have 2 teenage sons and that is what passes for wit in our house. But then I got lost in the fact that he didn't in fact have a vagina. And I thought I should point that out instead, because in some circles, say mine, that would be an insult. Then in the little room inside my mind where Dorothy Parker was holding court at the Algonquin, I thought maybe devitalize is just a medical term. Give the guy a break. But I didn't even know this man. Couldn't he just give me a prescription and say something vague about aging? What about euphemism? I guess devitalize was one because he went on to more vividly explain that my tissues were frankly deteriorating. At that point, I was thinking, but you haven't even seen the area in question. And how did you get this far without knowing how to talk to women? Devitalize reminds me of de-ice, which is what I was doing just before this tricky moment at the urgent care. My son was late to algebra because it's really cold and it took a while to clean the car. And at 8 o'clock, the door where he usually goes in automatically locks. So I had to take him around to the front and he dropped his phone in the snow and it got run over. So now there's a crack in the screen. He wants me to replace it, but I said, no, it still works. Thanks.
Laura, I love your poetry so much, as you know. You're so wonderfully wide-ranging in terms of tone that you can go from humor to the really serious biting commentary that's also in there, and that you navigate all these surprising digressions in narrative, which are also always incredibly carefully controlled to make us think about how seemingly dissimilar things, in this case, death and a bedsheet in France and an essay structure, or the speaker's vagina and an iPhone screen, are related in ways that we need to see and really think about in order to unlearn patriarchal language and supposed logic and violence. And I think about Patricia Lockwood saying that poetry, that similes in poetry can make things love each other, which I really like. And could you talk about how figurative language and those kinds of connections and sort of making things love each other that we don't usually think of in that conversation helps to unmake patriarchal thinking?
Sure. I feel like that's what the poem Philogocentric really is about. And I was just remembering that when I was a kid, my teachers would always cross out some of my adjectives or some of my similes and say, you need to choose one. And I would think to myself, why? Like each word was adding something different to the noun. And then also like the similes could point me in so many different directions. So if I choose one, I can only go in that direction. So I just remember feeling really kind of stamped down by some of the writing expectations that now ironically I perpetuate because I'm a composition teacher. And so I feel like the poetry can unmake that because you can make these leaps. You don't have to connect everything to the thesis. You don't have to add transitions. And the leaps are the fun part of writing to me. Cause like, I don't know, like when I wrote the part about the phone, I was like, I don't know if that's going to connect. But then when it did, it's so fun and surprising. And I feel like, so there, patriarchy, I wouldn't have been able to do that if you would have made me stick to the thesis. So I like it. And I also wanted to say that I feel like images, which I think figurative language help create, is a way of thinking that sometimes we think of as particularly feminine. Like we sometimes think of like masculinity as being like logical and linear, and femininity as being like imagey and feeling. And I always felt put down as a kid for having too many feelings and not enough thoughts. But Mary Ruefle has made me feel better about that because Mary Ruefle says that feeling is thinking. And then also I heard Claudia Rankin the other day on a reading. She said that the reason she loves poetry is because poetry privileges feeling. And I guess that's my other response to this is I just love that about poetry, that it says, you might not know yet how all of these things fit together, but you know, and you just need to trust the image and the simile. I know it was a lot, but I wanted to say thank you.
Oh, that was amazing. And I agree with every word of that. And that's so beautiful what Claudia Rankin said too.
No, I loved it. Yeah, it was great. Thank you.
Oh, that's also fantastic. So I'm up next for a reading, and I'm going to read two poems, the first of which takes on the story of an early 20th century artist model who was actually the most famous artist model in the early 20th century, but became forgotten after a mental breakdown in her early 30s. And her name was Audrey Munson. And she posed for a lot of allegorical statues, many of which are still visible around New York City, figures like beauty and memory and justice and the goddess of abundance. And this poem takes on imagining her first being asked to pose by the sculptor Isidore Conti when she was 15 years old. And this was in 1906. And he had asked her to pose in the altogether, which means to pose nude. And so I imagine this in her voice and what she was thinking. The altogether. He told me I'd have to pose in the altogether. He said it made no difference, clothing, fur, or the body undraped of everything but its entire form. True artists see only the work that we are doing. And my mother set her teacup in its saucer, such a faint white chiming of the wind and never. And I heard what I didn't say. His statue's bolder than real women, the marble I could be, daughter of a chisel, molten bronze. I felt him look me over, see what I already was, different altogether than I'd known. Someone with rooftops inside her, someone gleaming and solid, the perfect center of a set of Russian dolls, bright baby, bathwater shimmer of self. I'd throw anything off to uncover. Thank you. And then the second one is in the voice of the Russian fairy tale witch, Baba Yaga, who I imagine in various poems in this book speaking to situations in contemporary American society and using her great matriarchal witchy wisdom to cut through some things. And in this case, I imagine her in a feminist theory class. And the poem has an epigraph from old Peter's Russian fairy tales that says, "And has Baba Yaga really got iron teeth?" asked Vanya. "Iron like the poker and tongs," said old Peter. "What for?" said Marusha. Baba Yaga appears in Intro to Feminist Theory for an impromptu lecture. Dear class, dear guy who just raised his hand again to say the patriarchs were right to be worried. Women today are getting divorced, pregnant, teenage, independent. Just look at this country. Women are rising up like winter under asphalt, crumbling this nation's highways till the rumble strips make the sound of fraying nerves, until the baby teeth inside the mouths of families jostle loose and spit out bullets. Yes, I know bullets aren't iron. Yes, I have seen the blood. It's like the Bible, that part where God says, drive only in your lane or else the pig gets slaughtered, and also your daughter. That myth where the woman is a cave, a river no one can locate inside her. She moves room to room to room, in each the noise like bristles of a giant broom, sweeping each trace of her passing. Let's call the broom patriarchy. Let's call the girl Zelda. Let's say she holds her father's hand like a lion tamer holds the hoop, hoping danger sees its shiny ring and plunges through it. Let's say she has no father. Her father beats her. The cave of her body is overflowing with blind electric fish. She has surgery to remove the river, but when the surgeon looks inside, he finds a pair of ancient silver scissors. They've already cut through her. Remember how a woman is always divided? Who left those scissors inside her? Once upon a time last year, a woman was hogtied in a neighborhood park, stabbed until she died a mile from here. Once upon, a boy raised his hand to say, "You're confusing the system designed to protect you with anomalous violence." Dear boy, you are making my teeth ache like metal filings stuck in those patterns on a guidance counselor's desk. Once upon, a girl cried rape, cried beating, incest, silence, cried bullet, cried baby, cried. You get the picture, or don't you? Do you know the difference between a woman wrapped in plastic and a Christmas tree, a hula hoop and a hierarchy built like a ladder with rungs to where a mother is digging bomb rubble for the arm of her child? Yes, hand broom? How ironic. We both agree women have natural maternal urges. Yes, I call myself a witch. See witch as anomaly. See anomaly from deviation from the common rule, from inequality. Once upon a time, we told a story so many times it ceased to be anomalous, it remained anomalous. A girl drowned in the world's river, a witch tried to point out the water. A hand broom cried, see cry from squeal like a pig, see witch, see Circe, but you also eat children, see Leviticus and Jeremiah. See the way my mouth moves, that terrible clacking, that's statistics. 0% of the people in this room were not born from a woman. 0% of your fairy tales were written by fairies. Yes, I agree we can learn valuable lessons. If you put your fingers inside the rings on the handle and point the sharp tip up, you can blind yourself with scissors. Thank you.
That was beautiful.
Thank you.
Well, I would just say, first of all, Alexandra, I'm always in awe of your poetry. The technical sound elements you use, I won't even get started on because I'm envious of them, and the way that you weave structure into your poetry. That's another thing I admire. But I wanted to ask you about history and mythology, actually, because you do bring, like, you know, Audrey Munson and Baba Yaga into a lot of this, your latest book, which is so wonderful. With those mythological archetypes like Baba Yaga, there's a lot of poems about Baba Yaga in your latest book. They've survived all these centuries of patriarchy, patriarchal keeping, I guess I would say. How do you investigate their creation, their intention and their meaning? And do you find it necessary, like, how do you decide how you're going to subvert that portrayal that you discover in your research, or whether you play off of it? Like, Baba Yaga is such an interesting figure because of her, like, the origins of it, but also the way in which it's kind of used as a scary fairy tale for children. I even remember getting read Baba Yaga books, so you could speak a little to that.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. And honestly, that's how I came to write about Baba Yaga, is that my mother had read me Baba Yaga stories when I was a child, although our family is not Russian. And I was just terrified of Baba Yaga because she's got that chicken leg house that chases people and she's got iron teeth. And she was the ultimate scary witch figure to me. But as I got older, I started reading a little bit more about her and also thinking about that patriarchal construction of the scary witch, and learning that she also has a reputation for sometimes like guiding young girls who are lost in the woods. She can also be a wise and helpful mother figure. And so often, of course, women who are strong in any way are presented as witch-like. And so I wanted to write towards that and think about how she could speak to situations and speak from within both the patriarchal tradition and use that witchiness against them. Sort of like Laura was saying, you know, saying, take this patriarchy, right? That if she's going to be invested with that kind of power, she should use it to talk back to it and, you know, and be a kind of frightening figure in these ways. But then, of course, I, again, want to subvert her just being a frightening figure and also show her as somebody who is wise and who just has some other priorities from the patriarchy, such as watching out for women. And I think about this, too, in terms of kind of reorienting where we're looking at these stories from. Alicia Ostraker, in her really wonderful book about women's poetry, Stealing the Language, talks about that idea that feminist poetry is often about unlearning submission, and rather than looking up, for instance, at a patriarchal sky god looking down towards the ground or more horizontally. And so I think about where we're located within the stories, and that by having Baba Yaga be able to talk from within the construction of these fairy tales allows us to think about how those stories are constructed and change kind of the directions that we're looking at. And
kind of like,
yeah.
Would you like kind of like reclaiming it, but in a feminist light?
Yeah, and I think often that it's not that Baba Yaga, like there's another tradition that exists alongside the patriarchal one. I guess that's what I want to say, that all the time she has also been this wise figure, or there are other ways of looking at the story, so that there are always traditions that exist alongside the dominant one, and that by helping us to see that or reposition ourselves within it, which is one of the things that I think that persona and kind of offering voices from different perspectives can potentially do. So yeah, thank you for that. And then you are up next to read, yes?
Yes, I am. My brain's out of order today. Let's see here. I think I'm going to start, I'm going to read some from In Accelerated Silence, my last book. And I'll start with this one called Ode to Dark Matter. I speed through a moonless night, porch lights thinning into silhouettes of trees. Emptiness isn't empty, the radio scientist insists. Relieved you're here to hold the aching stars apart, a muted backdrop to the howl of headlights streaking by, I bend the pedal to the floor. His voice describes a mine deep under the earth where professors hunt the flutter of your wings in accelerated silence, wait for you to slip, to exhale into their sensitive machine, eager to assemble your breath in data streams. They think you are already theirs, a variable to ensnare in a net sum, the way children trust answers to soothe. Dear wild unknown, toe the borders of this universe far beyond our grasp. Whatever we see, we break, count and dismember all we touch. The earth, the atom, anatomy, Eve. Be the animal that escapes our love without a wound. I've got a lot of sciencey poems in here, and also kind of like, I guess cosmic in the sense of like astrology, or excuse me, astronomy. And so this next one's called Supermassive Star. It's a short poem. Supermassive star. Let there be, you said, and assembled me from fusion, fire, a timer set in motion for every reaction and equal opposite contraction. Don't pretend you're not a part of this. You called me here to burn. You called and I came willingly, lit like a birthday wish. Your auric little miracle, your magic machine. I clapped my hands, ignited every color until the trick backfired, until one dense atom spun in my core, a thin spider of iron. And so began the collapse, compacting mass, the glorious punch of gravity. Your word was my death, sutured within me. And then I'll read one more poem called Maybe. And I think this started out as not my favorite poem in the book, but became one of my favorites, I think. Who is the you in your poems, he asks, because it is capitalized. Do I have to know? I haven't been to mass since death, capital D, entered the narrative and sent my heart palpitating with rage at nothing in particular, because who can be blamed for unexplained cancer? You need to figure it out, he says, as in dissect the pronoun. In middle school, my classmate refused to dissect a grasshopper, the exoskeleton limp on its aluminum tray. She came to class the next day with a grasshopper painted in a, She came to class the next day with a grasshopper formed from clay, each appendage painted in immaculate rainbow colors. It glowed on the teacher's desk, hovered above the lesson plan on its stand, a vibrant idol outsizing all the dead ones put together. I suppose that was her point. Now my point. Am I avoiding the question? Our universe may be one of many in the multiverse, capital M. Maybe, as in somewhere on the spectrum between yes and no. One of several enigmatic answers the magic 8-ball we had as kids offered from its dark indigo fluid, a tiny triangular phrase bumping the window in its belly. One day ours stopped answering. Something about the buoyancy, or maybe one of us just shook it too hard. Thank you. It's always a privilege to read among such talent, I have to say.
That was great, Brooke. I love the science in your poems. I think it's really fascinating. And I guess I also love that girl in the last poem. So I just want to say that as a side note. My question relates to science, and it also relates to your question that you were asked, or the speaker was asked, who is the speaker, or who is the person being addressed, who is the you in your poems. So I noticed that there's some anger in your poems, which I love. The speaker is angry at whoever she's addressing, and sometimes I read it as the person who's being addressed is God, and sometimes I think it's science. I know many of the poems in your book allude to the patriarchy of traditional science. So my question is, how do you see your poems attempting to unmake the patriarchy of science and or religion?
Yeah, that's, it's interesting because like I did not plan that as I wrote the poems. Obviously it's kind of one of those emergent things, but I think that part of, I think that the book kind of, and a lot of my poems flip back and forth between science and religion and this idea of like having a concrete answer, right? And kind of alluding back to your poem, like that of like essays being phallic and like, there needs to be one main idea and like maybe there's not. And so the poem, even the title maybe, and many of the poems deal with this concept of patriarchy is there needs to be one answer. It needs to be concrete, objectified, scientifically measurable. And, I think that being a former teacher, like that I see that sometimes in education where it's like there's one right answer or there's one standard that fits all, and there's very little room for multiple answers or for different perspectives. And so and it always makes me think of like kind of like Virginia Woolf in A Room in One's Own. I might be getting this wrong, but I think at one point she says like men focus on the objects in the book and the women are about the kind of like global settings and things like that. And I've always been that sort of a person too. So I guess in my poems, I guess I'm indirectly saying that I look at the patriarchy that I'm addressing in the book as being this idea of like, there has to be an answer and it has to be knowable and quantifiable and measurable, versus this idea that there is a gray area of unknown. Because no matter if you go with this idea, if you're a religious person or a very scientific non-religious person, scientists reach this point where they just go, I don't know, as far as you go in the universe, what do you think's beyond that? And it's like, well, we don't know, but we think it's this. We just, we have no proof, but we have theories. And then, the same on the religious side, you say, well, I can't prove it, but I believe it, and so this idea of having to have a concrete answer or figure things out versus this idea that the universe can be open-ended and that there isn't a right answer per se. There's just multiple universes and multiple perspectives and multiple possibilities. So I think that honestly, my mission as a poet is to sort of explore that gray area or the unknown and to try to flush it out as I write. Like for me, that's so much more fascinating and invigorating, than trying to nail something down. So yeah, I guess for me, I even have a poem in that book where a teacher tells me that something has to be one way and I'm like, no, it doesn't. Because I love that idea that, that there are many different perspectives. And I think the female perspective brings so many different ideas, even to, well, I could go on and on, but I think you could take any field and look at how, when women entered that field, the field changed because it brought a brand new perspective that wasn't even kind of conceptualized before. So indirectly, maybe I answered your question.
You did.
I love exploring those unknowns. I guess that's very apropos of me to not give you a direct answer.
Perfect. And I'm just like shaking the magic 8-ball and you're like, no.
Yeah.
Thanks.
I think that was an incredible answer. And I love all those ideas too, Brooke. Kristen, you're up next to read. Yes.
Yeah. One thing I want to say is that just hearing all of you read is that to me, the subversion that's happening need not always be performative. And that's one of the things that's so interesting about Baba Yaga. Her image, who she was, acted in multiplicity, right? In the patriarchy, she was a witch and something to be feared, but she was also a guide. And every single time in lore or the archetype of the witch comes up, it's often that right beneath that is a guide that has been sent, and these etymological roots of fairy tales go back 5,000 years, and so the fact that it could not be performed, but was still happening, and that the multiplicity of meaning was happening in parallels and being carried through the patriarchy by the tellers all the time. It reminds me of syncretism, right? Like in Cuba, where my mom's from, they'll be worshiping one icon, which is a Catholic one, but right beneath it is a Yoruba, icon. And so that worship has always been performed for the gaze, right? But beneath it was the true idolatry, and to the extent that we as writers can imbue all of our writing with that multiplicity of meaning, I think it will survive. And I've been like obsessed with Sappho recently, and all of her work is found on these, papyrus strips that, now they're using literally like particle accelerators from Stanford to look beneath all the mathematical equations that have been, painted on top of it to find her work, and that's how women do meaning, right? It's inside and it will emerge in my mind. And yet the reading I'm going to read from Subduction, my novel, it traces this Latina anthropologist who's come to the Makah Indian Reservation, and she's on indigenous territory that does not pertain to her. But she's bringing a lot of damage in this community, damage that occurred because her sister and her husband had an affair and her husband left her for her sister. And so rather than taking a moment to heal herself and to reconsider her strategies and what she's going to do, she plunges right in, which is what a lot of us are doing in the pandemic right now, right? We're like marching, marching, marching. It's fine. We're, experiencing a collective grief and trauma, and yet we're not taking that moment to figure out how should we be relating to each other? How should we be healing this wound that was occurring prior to this, this plague? And when I think about this particular scene, so much damage is done by men, and yet many of the worst foot soldiers of the patriarchy that I've known have been women. So here we go. In this scene, by the way, Claudia has just had an affair with the son of her best research participant. So when I say she brings her damage, she's bringing the damage. So way out on the horizon, fog covered the curve of the earth, lolling, rolling in, a wall of white swallowing the neighboring peninsula, funneling through its forest to the mouth of the strait. Claudia watched through her sliding glass door. She could no longer see the fence between her and the shore. Soon her porch railings and picnic table were erased, and into this roiling blankness came the image of Maria and, unbelievable, the deep longing to tell her sister what she had just done, to ask whether she would be forgiven by the whom she did not know. Guilt always felt like their mother watching from beyond. When it got bad toward the end, Claudia convinced herself there would be visitations, clouds of citrus peel and brown sugar enfolding her in the night, which never materialized. On her last conscious day, her mother held her hand. Do well there. A buzz began within Claudia's chest, the urge to scream. You're sending me with him? How do you know he'll take care of me? Mija, you don't know what I know. Her eyes were liquid. It's best. Late morning light spilled through the wind chimes crowding the hospital ceiling. The spirals of sea glass dangled like jellyfish in thick, poisonous clusters. Her mother sold them before she got sick. Y Maria? Her father's family will take care of her until she's old enough. Then Thomas will bring her, he promised. Why would he? What do you know? And why just me? Tus dificultades with boys. You will drag her down. Be a good sister. Claudia watched fluid drip through the IV. Her books were stacked under the corner table, worn paperbacks abandoned on the beach by hotel guests. A miniature watercolor by Maria was pinned to the wall, a lobster pot. What if I want to stay? Wherever you are, I will be with you. Our spirit is undivided. Claudia imagined an orange, its bright lunar segments flying apart at the touch of one soiled finger, her own. She thought her mother dying was the worst thing. She hadn't realized how unprotected it left her. She and Maria had never had a dad, it seemed, but in truth, they did have fathers, only that Maria's walked north for work and Claudia's had flown south to play. Maria escaped the pressures that Thomas heaped on Claudia, as little make up for never having cared before. Claudia studying harder and harder, trying to put her wildness behind her as quickly as possible, not knowing that shame is patient. Her sister arrived years later to attend art school of all things, having relieved herself of the duty to be more than beautiful and charming. Everyone adored her. It was maddening. Claudia loved Maria, a complex, self-hating love, but love. And yet being compared at close quarters made her want to wriggle out of her skin. As children, they had always been together. Claudia came to measure her own response to the world by how it contrasted with Maria's, never more clear than the first time their mother showed them how to lobster, one of her many lines of income. Take the tail in one hand and the head in the other. Her mother's calloused fingers traced a striped carapace with a lobster's head separated from its armor. Twist in opposite directions until you feel the flesh tear. Its guttural cries quickened. Keep twisting. Pull the pieces away from each other, like this. Her forearm flexed, its scars lengthening as she turned the decapitated head from one side to the next, pivoting its ochre bodies for her daughter. Lacking claws, the lobsters held her hand in a scratchy embrace, whipping its antennae. Its beady eyes bulged. Translucent pink meat spilled from the tail. Their mother placed the chittering head in Claudia's palm. Its legs crawled, feeble, against her wrist, and encouraged Maria to take the tail. Her sister balked and hid her hands. Severing her regret, Claudia regarded the interaction at a distance, like a disembodied soul or the anthropologist she would become. She observed herself twisting off 5 more heads, learning how to spot the weakness, to find the fissures that widened with pressure. It would come in handy later, in the field. Managing each brisk beheading, she feigned nonchalance when her mother stopped consoling her sister and noticed her accomplishments scattered on the deck, lifeless. Deep blue water slapped the boat's hull. And that's when Claudia began to live on two planes of existence at once, marveling at their odd angles of intersection. Still, it's terrifying to see the world with yourself inside it. It scared her into performance, if only for her sister's benefit. Claudia skipped dinner that night. Maria ate her lobster, sopping up the butter with the last heel of bread. In the States, sisterhood returned with the chatty surety of college friends with a history of long nights and late brunches. Claudia did not question Maria's motives, but she must have felt abandoned in Mexico, must have nurtured a long aggrievement, for there could be no other explanation for husband theft. Anger entitled Maria. Claudia pictured her backyard's mossy old maple, branches studded with muttering crows. Andrew took all the patio furniture. Maria always liked it. The two of them spending summer evenings with bottles of white wine, grilling and listening to the radio while Claudia struggled through revisions. Maria never dedicated herself to anything but her own pleasure, which made her what Andrew always wanted Claudia to be, nothing more than available. You're like a guy, Maria once said. Claudia took it as a compliment. You know, men do what they want. That's power, she thought, but it's not true. Power is a symphony of personal bloodlettings. She knew that now. It didn't matter what people thought until it did. Damn her sister. Claudia pressed her hands and cheek against the coolness of the sliding glass door. Macaws slept in your ancestral bones, their blood thick as stone. Every place she lived seemed to crumble out of existence as soon as she left, disintegrating behind her into a pile of rubble. Thank you.
That was so beautiful and also so brutal. Thank you. Kristen, so one of the themes in Subduction is the complex relationship of your protagonist, Claudia, with her mother, which then bleeds into the relationship and the heartbreak with her sister. So can you talk a little bit about how fiction allows us to expose the way patriarchy deploys women to be its foot soldiers, as you said? And what emotional and creative twists and turns brought you to poke at the mother wound, which is, you know, I think we need to do more of that, to poke at that mother wound. And yet you do it with so much love and compassion for all the women in your story.
Thank you, Sonora. The mother wound goes deep, goes back millennia, right? Because the mothers have been preparing their daughters to survive the patriarchy. And the way that they often think to do that is to break them down, right? To break them down into their barest parts, to teach them to subvert and submerge themselves and perform what is needed. And because it comes from the mother, and because it comes within the childhood, it stays as a deep shame that's very hard to extricate from any person. Like shards found in the earth, you know, it just waits for you there to cut your hand when you're reaching into the loam, trying to plant something new, you know. And to the extent that, you know, it's so hard when that protectionism, it's thought to be protectionism, but it really, it's more than penetration. It is creating a wound that will not heal, right? Because it finds itself in fractal form in every single new situation. And every single time a woman tries to assert herself and to become something more than she had been allowed to be or been envisioned as being, she has to confront it again and again. You can think you can figure it out in one way, and then you get presented with a new situation. And all of a sudden, oh, there you are back in the day. And you're like, this gets so old. You know, it's so old. Why can't we just throw it off once and for all? But that healing is not linear. You know, and to the extent, Brooke, I was thinking about what you're saying about science, you know, the idea that something is either it's a binary and it's fixed and then it is linear is so patriarchal, right? And that is part of the reason why women have a trouble healing, is because we don't recognize, we're not taught that healing is not linear. Healing is cyclical, and it is happening through generations and between generations, and hopefully for future generations. But for that, you know, to some degree, teaching a girl how to protect herself means teaching her what is unjust, right? Rather than teaching her and bullying her and shaming her into accepting what is unjust as her due. And to the extent that I myself am now raising two sons, I'm looking forward particularly to Sonora's reading from How to Raise a Feminist Son, because we as parents need to prepare better soil for these seedlings. So take it away, Sonora.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Kristen. So I'm going to read from a chapter. It's chapter 2, and it's what if I'm not a good feminist, which is a question that we all have. I am 23 years old, and I'm standing completely naked in front of a tap trickling water in the middle of a busy railway platform in broad daylight at Allahabad Junction. Yes, in the middle of the platform, not inside a ladies' restroom, but in an L-shaped concrete enclosure that is tall enough to hide my body, but not my face. People are milling about the railway platform in the second oldest city of India, where both Hindu gods and Mughal emperors have left their patriarchal seeds. And if I can dare to lift my eyes from the water trickling down at my feet, I will look into the faces of men who have stopped to stare fixedly at my face as I try to collect enough water in a plastic mug to wash myself down. I am trying not to think of how easily any one of these men could step into the zig and then the zag of this enclosure I am in and see me naked. I have chosen to take the risk because my skin has been baking under the 106-degree Allahabad sun, and I have not showered in 2 days. My clothes, covering me from neck to ankle and designed to give me the highest degree of modesty, are close to giving me a heat stroke instead. So, my 23-year-old girl brain has chosen to let me take off all my clothes and run cold water down my body as I fight back hot tears. What am I doing here? Years later, I would learn that these taps of water and these bathing areas were provided as facilities for the 120 million or so ascetic sadhus who arrived at Allahabad Junction, mendicants congregating at the Kumbh Mela, the largest pilgrimage known to humankind. Religious men with their hair in dreads as long and knotted as tree trunks, their bodies thin and naked but for sacred ash, and their minds afloat under the influence of gods and ganja. Where they wash their feet to rid themselves of the mud settled between their toes from miles of devout procession, I am now washing the soot and dust and layers of dried, rancid sweat from hours of listless railway travel. These showers on the railway platform were meant for men. Almost all public spaces in India are meant for men. My family is far away in Bombay, and they have no idea that I'm standing naked and ashamed at this railway station. Not that they have been stellar at protecting me from men or Malays in the past. Still, I feel like they should know about this current situation. But this is 1991, and neither cell phones nor the internet are ubiquitous yet. My family has no idea that I was thrown off the train along with a handful of other reporters, all of them male, mind you. 4 of us are traveling home to Bombay after a few days in a remote village inhabited by a cult of skull worshippers who are hated and feared in these parts. The general feeling in my group is that I am the reason we are thrown off the train. My sex was listed as male in the railway ticket collector's list of oddly detailed demographic information. This discrepancy did not raise any eyebrows on the journey in, but one particularly diligent ticket collector, when he squinted up from his clipboard, saw me flagrantly female. One of the skull worshippers responsible for outreach and public relations had pre-booked the train tickets and had listed all the news reporters as men because he had never imagined that a woman reporter would be assigned to go into the dangerous interior villages of West Bengal, bordering the lawless state of Bihar. He never would have imagined that the father of an Indian girl would agree to let her go on such an assignment. Besides, what kind of name is Sonora anyway? Definitely male. The ticket collector was having none of this. The skull worshippers were up to no good, he decided. This beautiful 23-year-old girl with them might be someone they had kidnapped, he said to everyone in the railway compartment. They nodded. The ticket collector's way of dealing with this situation was to throw the skull worshippers and their 4 male accomplices, as well as the kidnapped girl, off the train at Allahabad Junction. Everybody in my group is now furious at me. This is what happens when you bring a woman along. And look at her now, shampooing her hair in the middle of the railway platform. If someone rapes her, it will be on us. So I'm going to skip ahead. A whole bunch of things happened. This is not my calling, I tell myself as I struggle to put my clothes back on over my wet skin at the railway platform shower. My audience of men grins at the obvious actions of me pulling on my underwear. They clearly have no train to catch. Nope, not my calling. World leaders like Václav Havel and Lech Walesa have asked the Communist Party of India to lay off these people that I had gone to interview. But I am no Gandhi being thrown from a train. I have no souls to channel and no souls to save. I want to find a good man and get married. I want to wear pretty clothes and shower in a private ensuite bathroom in which my husband has scattered rose petals. I have always hated the slightest bit of adventure, let alone revolution. I have a deep dislike for travel. I am fucking terrified of strangers. The only news stories I want to cover from here on out will relate to fashion, I decide. Or maybe something even safer, like the market price of mangoes. I never want to leave home. If they agree to let us board the next train out of Allahabad, and if I ever do find my way back to Bombay, I will never leave home again.
Flagrantly female, radical feminist, adventurer across transnational borders. I mean, you know, what the you of your 20s did not know about the you of now filled this book, right?
Thank you. Yes. And I'm sure for all of us, right? The us of our 20s.
Well, and what's strange to me to think about is how shame is weaponized within women to erase our capacity to move past boundaries. And yet your book is going to be published in Brazil. It's going to be published in India. And I know that you made several editions of the book to serve the mothers in those countries. So I was wondering if you could talk about the research you did to hone its message to those divergent, patriarchal, sexist, classist structures, and you know what these other mothers, you know, in the process of research, what you found these other mothers to be facing as they try to imbue their children and their sons particularly with feminist thought.
Yeah, thank you. Well, it starts with American mothers, right? Whatever American mothers means. So what I loved, and the reason I went with Sasquatch Books and my editor there, Hannah Elnan, was that for her, an immigrant woman like me, an Indian American woman, writing about raising a feminist son is the central feminist story, right? So it's not about a niche kind of a situation. She says she was looking for writers to tell, or writers, intersectional writers or intersectional feminists to tell the central feminist American story. And so for me, the main thing was, how do I relate to other American mothers, right? First of all, and having raised a son here, he was 2 years old when we left India. But raising him here as a single mother, raising him in a different culture from the one that I was raised in, right? And the main thing being that I was taking him away from the patriarchal privileges that he would have in India, right? But then arriving here in America and seeing like effing toxic masculinity play out in so many ways, along with racism against my boy. He's a brown-skinned man, right? So who is the mother that I'm talking about in this? Which mother am I trying to relate to? I can tell my story, and then in that specificity of the chaos of my story is something for all mothers to take, right? Or I hope, at least that's what I hope. Then when Penguin Random House asked my agent to buy the book, they said something like, could you tweak it a little bit because you're from India, so maybe we can bring in a little bit. And I said, sure, I'll tweak it a little bit. Hell no, that wasn't just tweaking it a little bit, because after we started talking, I realized that there's a huge, I mean, I'm writing it as an intersectional feminist in the US. So that there's that consciousness of being in the US, right? And then there's a whole chapter on race and about raising a brown-skinned boy, but whether white mothers of white sons feel how do they raise those boys with a sense of guilt around race and gender, and feminism? And then is it a burden for boys of color in the US to also be feminists, right? So I'm teasing that out and then realizing, wow, this doesn't make any sense for an Indian audience, right? So then I had to bring in caste, which I was born and raised in a Brahmin family, which is an upper caste family, which is what I rescued my son from. Rescued, who knows? But so I had to go back and tease that out, like how much of the violence that my father and my brother were perpetrating was rooted in caste and in that kind of patriarchy. So teasing out racialized patriarchy, teasing out caste patriarchy. And then, I didn't know that it was going to sell in Brazil, but interestingly, one of the psychologists that I talked to in the book, because I brought in so much research, is from Brazil, and she was talking about her stories about her husband having been raised to go fight, like not let himself be bullied. That whole patriarchal thing, like don't let other boys beat you, go back there and fight, when the son was really crying, right? And how we talked about how difficult it was to do that with our kids. I'm sure you find that too, Kristen. Like, what is the message we give them? Do they fight? Do they get beaten? Like, can there be something in between? So I was fortunate to have all these influences and all these stories come in, and then also to realize that each of these layers, like if I layer that in there with, is going to speak to a parallel layer somewhere else, because the truth is that every effing culture has figured out some way to be patriarchal, right? Like some nuanced and crazy and gnarly way to perpetrate patriarchy. So that's my long, complicated answer to your question.
Well, I hope that you're saddled with many more revisions. Because I want this book in many editions in many countries, and I believe it's coming out April 6th.
Yes, April 6th.
Yeah, you have an event coming up at Elliott Bay Books on April 7th. I saw.
I do. So, yeah, Ijoma Ulu is going to be asking me questions, so that's going to be cool with Town Hall and Elliott Bay Books. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing. I'll be bringing this book into my own parenting. So,
thanks.
That's so exciting. That was so fabulous, Sonora, and all of you. And I'm so excited to read that entire book. Does anyone want to make final comments, ask each other more questions? There's so much that's been sparked in my mind from this conversation.
Well, I have a question actually, because, I'm a debut author. So I've been, publishing as a journalist for 17 years, but as an author, this is my first book, but most of you have several books out. And I wonder if you were able to trace your own evolution as a feminist thinker across the course or trajectory of those books, and what you found about your past self as you've looked back over those. And maybe I'll saddle you, Laura, with this question first, because I want to hear your answer.
Sure. My mom she was a professor of women's studies at Gonzaga for 41 years. She started the program there. So I grew up just steeped in feminism, and I'm the only daughter, and I have four brothers, and then I have 2 sons and like 7 nephews. Like I'm like the only girl in the family. And I feel like all of my work is about feminism, because all the books on my coffee table when I was growing up had the word women in the title. Like, I just remember just being kind of that was the main focus for my mother's life. And I felt like she was the person I was going to follow. So right now I'm working on a book that's really explicitly about feminism, but I feel like if I look at all my books, they're always circling back to that. So I guess that's not very helpful in the evolution of how you approach it. Maybe I feel like I'm changing a little bit because I'm able to be a little bit angrier in my feminist work as I get older, that I wasn't able to do when I was younger. So,
well, it does demonstrate that the work of one generation can provide a foundation for the next, right? There doesn't have to be constant slippage into the past.
Right. Yeah.
So that's nice.
Yeah.
I'll follow up on that, because I had sort of an opposite experience. I was raised in a family of women by a very strongly matriarchal mother, but who explicitly did not consider herself to be a feminist. And although she absolutely was in all ways, except she didn't like the terminology, but therefore I didn't know until I took a class in feminist philosophy in college that I was a feminist. But still, it's taken me a long time to be able to find the voices within myself, and like writing through some of the personas, like I was talking about, has helped me find the voices within myself through which I can be more angry, like you're saying, and be more direct about some of these subjects, but in ways that doesn't just feel didactic. When I was first trying to write more feminist poetry, and I think that there's definitely a lot that's feminist in my first book. My second book, I really took on themes of Western expansion and how women have been historically treated within some of those narratives. So that one began to be more in that, more feminist as well. But this third one, I was much more conscious of it. And part of what helped me to get in touch with some of those voices was working with an interdisciplinary arts collective called the Basque Collective. And there was a musician, a visual artist, a dancer, and me. And we were given a grant for something called Play Like a Girl, in which we investigated that language of people being told how they're supposed to play and how they're supposed to present themselves. Like, what does that mean to play like a girl? How could we begin to reclaim that? And it was actually doing work through that and really kind of investigating what poetry could offer in relation to those other art forms. And then stretching myself by performing poems and being on stage as part of dance performances and everything too, that I started to find a space in which I could kind of embody literally, and then also embody in my poetry more of the range of emotions that I felt as a woman in the patriarchy. So.
You know, it's people always talk about anger like it's a bad thing, but I think of it as like the cupped ember that's being carried across the steps, the swaths of time, right? And then will provide the heat that allows for a gathering. And that to me, Darcy Steinke has this book called The Flash Count Diary, and it's such a fantastic book. And it's talking about perimenopause and matriarchal leadership across species, including orcas. And one of the things that she talks about is that women are literally being medicated out of their perimenopausal rage and menopausal rage, and that is actually suppressing a revolution and a rebellion that it would occur if women were actually reckoned with all the ways that they are marginalized as they grow into their wisdom in this culture. So I can't recommend that book more highly. I love it so much. And it speaks to how science can really imbue literature with its wisdom. And I wondered, Brooke, how you felt over the course of your books about bringing that evolution into the work.
Yeah, what I was thinking about that as Laura and Alexandra were answering that question. It's so interesting to me because I feel like I fall into Alexandra's camp of like, I never identified as a feminist until I got to college and like learned kind of what that entailed. I came from a very conservative family. And so as I began writing, I didn't really pay attention to my perspective and my experience as a woman, but as that has evolved, I feel like I got angrier and angrier. But also I think I've gotten stronger, and maybe that's in my professional role too as a leader, but having to stick up for myself in, when a lot of leadership and other executive directors are male. But I would also say like in writing, I do feel like it's sort of, not to go back to Virginia Woolf, but I do feel like it's been a little bit of a room of one's own for me, like my space that I am very protective of, even when I share with other writers. And I think that's because of what you said, actually, I think, because I thought you said it so beautifully, Kristen, that that the foot soldiers of patriarchy can often be women, and some of the most vitriolic ones at that, which we've seen on a kind of national level at some points this year already. But and the way I felt like you were speaking in poetry at one point when you're talking about like fractals of shame being deeply embedded. I'm just like, oh my God, that's a poem right in itself. That's like talking about feminism and just like the experience of being female. But so I would say I've never intentionally like put that perspective in my poetry, but I think that as time has gone on, I've recognized those fractals in my own personal life and kind of dealt with them on the page. And also, I do think that it is, I trust when women read my work more and give me feedback. I don't know if that's fair, but I feel like especially because of the kind of uncharted ground I'm trying to do sometimes when I feel like I have an open-minded woman read my work, I can get that feedback. Like I feel like they're getting where I'm coming from because they've had a similar experience. And so, which is not to say that like I did not have you know, other gendered readers that were incredible. But I do feel like I tend to seek that out just because of my life experiences and the ways in which I'm still dealing with my shards of shame and stuff. But anyway, so I guess I would say that I've never really been conscious of it, but I become more conscious of it. And anyway, yeah, so I'm still growing in that area, I would say. Yeah.
I love that point about who we trust our work with too, to help it grow and to influence us. And that's so crucial as well. So Nora, I'm curious about your answer to this question too.
Yeah, and I want to make sure that we get Kristen's response as well. So I'll just say that, you know, just today, this morning, I had to pick up the phone and call an uncle of mine in India who is going after my sister for something and accusing her of something. And I had to call him and tell him, you're a very small man and I never want to talk to you again. And I am his favorite niece. So I was able to do that and have it know that it hurt, right? And embrace that thing that they've started to say about me, that I'm just so angry and so no man ever sticks it out with me, right? Isn't that the worst thing you can say about a woman? And I'm totally embracing that. And I'm totally embracing it because that is who I am. I mean, needless to say, I mean, you know, I walked away from my men, but of course in the patriarchal world, that's never the thing. Like it just was too much for those men to bear me, right? And so they left. Lies. But you know, just embrace it, because you'll never be able to live out, you know, they're gonna say what they say. And so embracing that anger, being able to call someone a small man and put the phone down and walk away from it, knowing that you spoke the truth and you spoke, you know, it's integrity, right? And when the thing with raising a feminist son has been important, and I know this is about writing, but all of, you know, life and writing is back and forth, right? But having my son listen to things like that has been really important. Having him hear a woman's voice raised in anger has been really important, because he will know how to recognize a woman's anger and to deal with it, and either to get out of the way or deal with it if he's the cause of it, right? But each piece of writing that I've done has brought me closer to this. One is, of course, you know, the sad thing is that if women's success, right? Like once you're successful, people tend to leave you alone a little more, and you can create more and more solitude and more success for yourself. So you have to get to that point, at least in India. If you're seen as successful, you have a voice. But so in that way, the writing and the books being published leads to that success. I'm playing with my dog as I do this. But then it gives you that voice, and you know, if you don't use it for your sisters, you know, yeah. So, but Kristen, what do you have to say?
Well, you know, when I started thinking about kind of unmaking the patriarchy of my own mind, one of the things that I was raised within a Cuban Catholic household in which, you know, God is a man. I mean, a man. And they prayed to God, the man, every day. I was like, why are they always asking for forgiveness? It was, you know, so interesting to me. Like, what have they done? And I realized that what they had done that I considered to be unforgivable is that they had taught me that the Godhead was masculine. And so in my next book, I've been doing a lot of research into these pagan mother goddess worshiping cults, because in fact, the Godhead was a woman. And the founder of cities, the bringer of mathematics and agriculture, you know, these goddess figures created capacity for imagining oneself into the structure in a way that current religions often do not. And so I'm taking it back to BCE. And of course, you know, those times were incredibly patriarchal as well, but finding within those structures the capacity to rethink the way we consider divinity today is part of my next novel, Great Mother. And so it's research, and along the way, really kind of steeping myself in the thinking of women through the millennia, which, I mean, women have been carrying this for so long, and yet each generation often embodies this European romantic ideal that we have to create anew, which is such a patriarchal norm. Instead, we need to be building the canon, as you say, hearkening to our sisters and recognizing the work that others have done and then carrying that forward so that is not lost. And so that's been part of my archival research and bringing it into fiction. It's also hybrid text. So there's memoiristic aspects of it where I'm looking at the secrets of my, that have been carried through diaspora in my family and how those have affected my own reckoning with myself as a mother. So great mother. It'll probably be a year or two until it's finished. Hopefully by the end of the pandemic.
That's also so exciting. And everything you just said is so beautiful and such a wonderful further reinforcement about why these kinds of conversations are so crucial and wonderful for us to get to have, to be in community, even if it's on Zoom, with other amazing women writers and get to really start to delve into some of our thoughts about how we got here and where we're going from here. So I'm just so grateful to get to spend this afternoon with all of you, and I look forward to seeing you all out of screen sometime in the not distant future. And I think that we'll wrap it for there. Thank you again to Get Lit for hosting this conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you all so much for
Alexandra.
being here.
Yeah.
And thank you, Alexandra, for moderating and keeping that conversation going. I just want to say this event was 2 years in the making, and it's been so wonderful to see it come together today. Selfishly, as director, sometimes I don't get to go to all of the events, and so I'm so excited. The sort of silver lining of this pandemic is that I will be able to go to all of the events, and I'll be able to enjoy all of them. So thank you all again to all the authors for taking part today. And for our audience, don't forget that you can learn more about our authors, check out other festival events, and donate to help support Get Lit by checking out our website, getlitfestival.org. And thank you all again for joining us.